Baltasar Gracian is loved by Nietzsche and by Voltaire. Nietzsche writes about Baltasar. In The Experience of Life, Gracian shows incomparable wisdom and clear-sightedness. Voltaire writes, I thank you for Gracian's hero. Let's find out why. How singular I want you to be. With a book that is a dwarf, I want to make a giant. In the shortest of sayings, set down immortal deeds. I will try to make you the greatest person possible, a miracle of perfection, a king, if not by birth, by deeds. Seneca formed a prudent person, Aesop a shrewd one, Homer a warrior, Aristotle a philosopher, Tacitus a statesman, Castiglione a courtier. Copying some of the choicest parts of these great masters, I intend to sketch out a hero, a universal prodigy. That is why I made this pocket mirror, from the glass of others and my own fragile nature. At times it will delight you, at others counsel and instruct. In it you will recognize the person you are or the one you ought to be. You will find here a book neither of statescraft nor of economics, but a politics of governing yourself, a compass for sailing toward excellence, an art for reaching distinctions with just a few rules of discretion. I write in brief because your understanding is large. My words are as short as the subject is long, but let me not detain you. Go forward. That was an excerpt from A Pocket Mirror for Heroes by Baltasar Gracian. And as I mentioned, Gracian is loved by Nietzsche, by Voltaire, by Schopenhauer, and a bunch of other people. So who was this guy? Who was Baltasar Gracian? Gracian was born in 1601, died around 1658. He was born in a village in Aragon, Spain, completed his schooling in Zaragoza, Valencia. And then he became a Jesuit priest. And he spent the rest of his life as a professor of theology, philosophy, a preacher, a confessor, a chaplain, an administrator, and a writer. And even though he was a priest, he was often at odds with the Jesuit community. Many of the Jesuits didn't like the fact that Gracian was writing all these books, especially because his topic touched on how one should live in this world and how one can live in this world and become better, more excellent, but not only in the spiritual life or in their administrative life in the courts. So Gracian, according to the Jesuit community, he was too focused on the worldly things. Gracian, however, was able to surpass the Jesuit community and the restrictions because he met this one gentleman. In his early assignment to Huesco, Spain, he met Vincencio Juan de Lastanosa, a wealthy nobleman. Lastanosa's circle of friends ranged from scholars to artists, to statesmen, to sculptors, and he had this vast library, and in this library, he had collections of paintings, sculptures, weapons, armors, coins, and in this library, Gracian found a place for his intellectual curiosity to grow, and it was Lastanosa who paid for the publication of almost all of Gracian's books, which, if he had to go through the Jesuit order, would not have likely passed. And Lastanosa published a lot of these books, defended his writing, and helped him during his struggle with the Jesuit order. So this particular book that I'm reading, that we're going to go through, A Pocket Mirror for Heroes, is a compilation of a lot of his other books and works. The translator, Christopher Moore, writes, A Pocket Mirror for Heroes is a selection from El Hero, El Deserto. The section entitled Beveled Edge draws mostly from Gracian's allegorical novel El Criticon, but also occasionally upon his treatise on wit. Christopher, the translator, does a beautiful job in translating the work. The prose is awesome. The writing is clear and lovely to read. Gracian, throughout his work, is trying to walk on a knife's edge between being too worldly and being too spiritual. And at times he sounds contradictory. He'll say one thing and then, later on he'll say the total opposite, and we'll see some examples of this. One of the things that comes up early on is he is upset because he believes that we're all fooled by nature. Since we are born without any knowledge of what life is, we are very naive into what will happen to us. And he goes on to say, if only we knew what life has instilled for us when we grow up, then none of us would choose to be born. So he writes, nature was a stepmother to man. Depriving him of knowledge at birth, she grants it to him at death. At birth, so that he will be insensible to the gift he is receiving. At death, so that he can better feel the mischiefs that conspire against him. His point is, you only really come to understand what life is about when you're about to die. When you're on the edge of your death, that is when you realize what this whole existence is all about. Similar to the last episode we did with Paul Kalanitzky. Paul comes to the realization and faces his mortality only after he is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And then he truly starts reflecting on his death. And through his reflection, he comes to the understanding that what is most important to him is the love that he has for his wife, and for a brief 8 months in his life, the love that he has for his daughter. And in it, he says, the love that he has for his daughter is the kind of love that doesn't want anymore, that is satisfied in it. But Gracian is not happy that we only get to understand life at death. So he writes, nature was crafty and perhaps even dishonest when she brought us into this world. She arranged for us to do so without knowledge, and therefore without suspicion. For we come darkly, even blindly, into this world, and begin to live without noticing that we are alive, and without knowing what it is to live. As a child, man is hushed by any childish things, content with any toy or trinket. He seems to have entered the realm of happiness, but is really a captive to fortune. By the time he opens the eyes of the soul and realizes he has been tricked, he is hopelessly trapped, stuck in the mud from which he was formed, and try to escape as best as he can. I am persuaded that, were it not for nature's universal ruse, no man or woman would want to enter a world so deceptive, and few would choose to go on living. For who would knowingly set foot in a false kingdom and true prison, only to suffer so many different punishments? In the body, hunger, thirst, cold, heat, weariness, nakedness, pain, and disease. In the mind, deceit, persecution, envy, scorn, dishonor, turmoil, sadness, fear, anger, and despair. All this in order to be condemned, in the end, to a miserable death, with the loss of everything: house, estate, belongings, honors, friends, relatives, brothers, parents, and life itself, just when we have come to love it most. Nature knew perfectly well what she was doing, and man accepted in ignorance. Whoever does not know you, O life, let him esteem you. But whoever has awakened to truth would choose rather to be transported from the cradle to the coffin, from the womb to the tomb. A common presage of misery is the tears we cry at birth, and the clarion call with which this man, this woman, this king or queen enters the world is none other than weeping, a sign that our only realm is sorrow. What can we expect of life that begins with the screams of the mother who gives it and the weeping of the child who receives it? So he's talking here about how if we knew the realities of this life, right, the suffering, the deceit, the fear, the anger, the hate, the death, none of us would choose to enter into this world. And he comes across as a nihilist, quite pessimistic about life, especially in that last sentence, right, when he says, what can we expect of a life that begins with the screams of the mother who gives it and the weeping of the child who receives it? I never really thought about it that way, that the beginning of life starts with the screaming of the mother and the screaming of the child. Now, to me, Gracian stopped his analysis too soon, because right after a woman gives birth, she forgets all about the pain and embraces her child, and the crying of the child, though it seems like suffering, is the first time a child takes a breath in this world. Right there is the commingling, the duality of life, suffering, happiness, crying in pain, and rejoicing in tears. Truth is, all the things that Gracian mentioned, right, the suffering, the deceit, fear, the anger, it is through all these realities we come to understand and see the beauty of life. Without suffering, we couldn't understand happiness. Without turmoil, we wouldn't understand peace. Without fear, we wouldn't understand courage. Without anger, we wouldn't understand serenity. And without death, we would not understand life. And Gracian later on comes to a very similar conclusion. But the point he's trying to make here is how life is filled with suffering. And the suffering can often make somebody not want to continue existing. But Gracian doesn't stop there. He ends up saying life is beautiful, life is worth living. He has this one line right at the end of the book that stood out to me, and I quote, "Philosophy itself is nothing but a meditation upon death. We must think about it often to do it well but once." You meditate upon your mortality often, but you only do it once. And the whole point of philosophy is to learn to meditate upon it. It's not as easy as it sounds, and many philosophers, professional quote-unquote philosophers, don't meditate upon their own death. They are terrified of their own death. And so if we understand what Gracian is saying here, it means that to do philosophy is to be able to meditate upon death properly, so that when it comes, or when death comes at the door, at the foot of your bed, you are ready for death. You embrace him as a friend. But to do this meditation, there are a few things that you need. There are a few prerequisites. Human beings are the only creatures that we know of that can reflect upon their own life, upon their own death, upon their own origin. And that is because we are rational animals. And because we are rational animals, there are things that we can do, there are things that we can perfect, like our virtues, which Gracian strongly emphasizes. The virtues which will help us become more excellent. So he writes, "Man was made from the rest of creation. His perfections came to him as a tribute, but on loan. Heaven gave him his soul, earth his body, fire his warmth, water his humors, air his breath, the stars his eyes, the sun his radiant face, fortune his possession, fame his honors, and time his age, and the world his home. Friends gave him company, parents character, teachers wisdom, and when he saw that all of these goods were movable, he is said to have asked, 'What exactly belongs to me? If all this is borrowed, what do I get to keep?' Virtue, it is yours alone, and no one can revoke it. All is nothing without her, and she is complete in herself. Other goods are in jest. She alone is in earnest. She is the soul of the soul, life of life, radiance of all gifts, crown of perfection, perfection of all being. She is the center of happiness, throne of honor, joy of life, satisfaction of the conscience, breath of mind, source of contentment, font of happiness, and feast for the intellect, the will, and the memory. She is rare because she is difficult, and wherever she is beautiful and well esteemed. People want to resemble her, and few possess her in truth. The vice hide under her cloak and imitate her actions, and even the worst people want to be taken as good. All would like her for others, few for themselves. All want to be treated faithfully and not gossiped about, deceived or insulted, but few bestow that treatment on others. She is lovely, noble, and gentle, and all the world conspires against her. True virtue has hidden herself away. When we think we've found her, we've seen only her shadow, which is hypocrisy. A kind person, a just one, a virtuous one, is as rare as the phoenix and no less immortal." This helps answer why you should live a good life, why you should live a virtuous life. As Gracian puts it, everything that you have is on loan. Right? Your humor is on loan. Your perfections in general are on loan. The only thing that you have, the only thing that you have to show for your life at your death is your virtue. Right? As he writes, what exactly belongs to me? If all this is borrowed, what do I get to keep? And the answer is virtue. It is yours alone, and no one can revoke it. And this is similar to what in the Dhammapada Buddha says about how if you have overcome your desires, overcome your passions, nobody can take it away from you. Not your parents, not your friends, not your enemies. It is yours alone. And this is what Gracian is saying here. And when you have virtue, virtue is the center of happiness, the throne of honor, the joy of life, the satisfaction of the conscience. breath of mind, source of contentment, font of happiness, and feast for the intellect. And the reason it is all these things is because you have become the master of your desires. You are not being controlled by your passions. You are not being controlled by your emotions. You are like a good king who reigns over his kingdom, his body, and his mind. And to get to this point, the very important thing you must do is be consistent in your working towards cultivating virtue. As he writes, constancy helps us deal not only with people, but with the virtues themselves. And he goes on to give the example of Demetrius, the first king of Macedonia, who lived a life of inconsistency. Gracian writes, as a warrior, he was the capital of all virtue, and in peace, the providence of all vices. In war, he made peace with goodness. In peace, made war on it. And hence, Demetrius I was not revered by anybody because he was inconsistent. Demetrius I was a different man every time he woke up. And if you're like Demetrius, you will never be virtuous. So Demetrius I stands as a warning for us, not only to walk beside virtue, but to be virtuous ourselves. For it is through having virtue on our side that we avoid the vices that are so easily in front of us. And we avoid the downfall of many men and women who've gone before us without virtue. As Gracian writes, some place their happiness in their belly, asking nothing from life but food, while their higher powers slumber, meaning the mind, the intellect. Then he goes on to say, their reason is on vacation, their understanding languishes. Others find pleasure only in material objects, the lowest part of life, and are as indignant in understanding as wealthy in belongings. Only those who know live the life of people. Half of life is spent in conversation and attentive learning. Shared with others is a feast for the prudent. So he's saying when you have virtues, not only can you avoid these downfalls of, ignoring your higher powers, your understanding, but you start to understand that a good life is spent in conversation, being attentive, learning from others, being surrounded by good friends and wise friends, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So then the quote, which I mentioned earlier, philosophy itself is nothing but a meditation upon death. We must think about it often to do it well once. That starts to make more sense when you realize that in death, there is nothing that you can take with you. Everything, no matter the honor, no matter the fame, no matter the wealth, the estates, none of it you can take with you. The only thing you can take with you is the virtues you've cultivated over the last 50, 60, 80, 90 years that you've lived. And so then it starts to make sense why Gracian says, everything is borrowed. The only thing that is truly yours is your virtue. And you become virtuous through wisdom, through gaining wisdom. So he writes, the wise measure out their lives as though they had both a short and a long time to live. Life without a rest is like a long day's journey without an inn. We live on average almost 90 years now. That is both a very long time for somebody who was just born, but also a very short time for anybody who's grown into adulthood and realized how fast time flies. Whatever age you are, you likely remember being a teenager and you feel like you were just a teenager just a short time ago. Or you remember being a 30-year-old very short time ago. You might be 70 right now. Hence, Gracian says, the wise measure out their lives as though they had both a short time to live and a very long time to live. It is short in that you can die tomorrow, but also you could end up living for another 50 years, another 30 years. You could end up living until you're 105. And once you see this, you realize you need to take time for rest, a time for solitude, a time to recharge your soul. As he says, life without a rest is like a long day's journey without an inn. If you haven't listened to the episode with Joseph Pieper on leisure, I recommend listening to that because I dive into why Pieper emphasizes the importance of cultivating leisure in our own lives in this world that we live in, where it's very productivity focused, that every single minute has to be accounted for. And Pieper's point is that living a life like that is not actually a life at all. A life that is worth living, a life that is a good life, a life that is filled with virtue, with goodness, with wisdom, is one that has leisure involved in it. And he talks about what leisure is. Leisure is not sitting around and lazing on your couch, but leisure is actually a type of work, but a very different type of work, right? It requires your attention. It requires your focus. It requires you to do work so that your intellect can apprehend the beautiful, can apprehend the infinite. So coming back to Gracian writes, the wise have always drawn on reflection, imagining themselves newly arrived in the world, pausing over its prodigies, for each thing is one, admiring perfection and ingeniously philosophizing. So in this section, what he's trying to get here is the wise people are able to reflect on their life, are able to see how they've done certain actions or thought about certain things in the past and see the beauty of it, see where they failed. And so when they enter a new moment, when they experience something new, they're able to do it either more perfectly, with more wisdom, and appreciate the moment, right? So he gives the example of strolling through a beautiful garden. You're walking through it, but because the garden's beautiful, you're distracted by the whole thing. And you fail to notice the loveliness of the plants that are beside you and the flowers that are budding. And so as you walk down and through this garden, you suddenly realize there are all these plants and flowers around you. So you turn around and you go back to the beginning and you begin to enjoy each and every one of these plants and flowers. And he's saying that that is what wise people are like. They turn around and appreciate, and in appreciating, they renew their enjoyment in these things and enjoyment in the preciousness of life. That it gives the wise a fresh pair of eyes to approach whatever comes next. It's both a reminder to slow down our actions, to slow down our rambling mind through solitude, through living non-distracted lives, so that we can appreciate the moment that we have with our family, with our friends, whatever craft that you're perfecting. And Gracian has these 4 ways that he says you can become wise, you can learn, and you can grow in your knowledge. And I quote, there are 4 ways to know much. Live for many years, that's 1. Travel through many lands, read many good books, which is easiest, and converse with wise friends, which is most enjoyable. You and I are reading good and great books to learn the lessons from the wise, the great people who've walked before us hundreds, thousands of years ago. And we're taking their lessons and applying into our lives. So Gracian was born 1601. And yet in this book that's over 400 years old, there's a tremendous amount of wisdom, practical wisdom in it. I quite like the last section, the last part when he says, converse with wise friends. The Buddha in the Dhammapada says something similar, but he finishes his teaching with, if you can't find any wise friends around you, then go live alone, because it is better to be by yourself than to be in the company of fools. And King Solomon in the book of Proverbs warns us not to surround ourselves with fools, because fools will deceive us and drag us into evil things if we surround ourselves with them. Gracian goes on to write, seeing makes us knowledgeable, but contemplation makes us wise. All of the old philosophers traveled, exploring first with their eyes and feet, but later with their intelligence, and this is what made them so rare. The crown of discretion is to know how to philosophize, drawing from everything, like the solicitous bee, either the honey of usefulness or wax for the candles of disillusionment. One of the recurring themes throughout all the books that we've done is this idea of contemplation. Contemplation is what allows us to take the abstract and find ways to apply it into our lives, making them concrete, making them practical. But that is just one aspect of contemplation. Contemplation as a whole doesn't always have this usefulness that we often hear about. The highest form of contemplation is not for anything else, is not to take or get anything useful out of it in the sense of productive usefulness. The best example of this is the rise in meditation apps across our generation. There are lots of different meditation apps that tell you, okay, if you meditate for 10 minutes, if you meditate even for 5 minutes every day, then you'll be better able to perform at your job as a CEO, as a mother, as a father, as a student, as a professor. And so meditation apps are pushed for their utility, right? So do meditation, contemplation for this utility. That is, you become more productive, you become a better cog in the machine. But contemplation, the type that Gracian's talking about, the type that Buddha is talking about, the type that Lao Tzu is talking about, it's not the same type of contemplation. It's not the same type of meditation here. And Pieper, in the episode on leisure, specifically addresses this, that leisure, a life of leisure is a life of contemplation, and a life of contemplation does not do contemplation for its utility. But you contemplate, you meditate to know yourself better, to understand who you are, to understand the world, the universe better, to understand your relation to the world, to another, to see that you are not this distinct, divorced creature unrelated to anything around you. And you're able to contemplate deeper. The wiser you get, the more you understand the world, the more you read, the more you converse with wise friends. He makes this remark throughout the book. It's very apt that wise people are like bees who collect from flowers, and fools are like flies who sit on dungs. A very good metaphor for us to remember, that we want to spend our time collecting from flowers like bees versus like flies who sit on dung. Flies fill themselves with crap, and for us that crap is noise, vanities, gossips, hatred, any of these things that fill you up with tremendous amount of negativity and tremendous amount of anxiety. Those are the things you want to eliminate. But it's not like we can eliminate it completely out of our lives. Even if you decided to go live in the desert as a ascetic monk with nobody around you, build yourself a high tower where you can sit in it and nobody will disturb you, you will still have to battle yourself. You will still have the noise that is in your head, the vanities that you might be seeking through your ascetic practices. So ultimately, you can never escape until you die. But what you can do is, through solitude, through contemplation, start to eliminate and turn down the volume on these things. So Gracian has this quote: "A great talent never surrenders to changes in mood or allows its own peculiar temperament to run amok. It towers above such a vulgar lack of composure. One of the great effects of wisdom is self-reflection, and if you can recognize your present disposition, you can master your own mind, conquer your moods, and not be dragged tyrannically from one sort of foolishness to another." What he's doing here is giving you the practical effects of these things, right? The practical effect of self-reflection. He's not saying become wise so you can have these other things. He's saying when you're wise and you contemplate, there are positive effects that come from it. Which leads us to this point about knowing yourself, of self-reflection, something that we've talked about previously in other episodes. So Gracian has this quote: "If there were mirrors for the understanding as there are for the face, the understanding must be its own looking glass, but it is easily falsified and tarnished. As judges of ourselves, we are quick to find escape clauses and take bribes from emotion." Gracian's point is the only way you can understand yourself, the only way you can understand who you are, your predispositions, your desires, your weaknesses, your strengths, is through contemplation, is through self-reflection. Right? That is your mirror. You don't have an external mirror. You might have people who tell you your faults, your strengths, but ultimately you are the best one who knows who you are. And sometimes you are not the best person who knows yourself because you haven't spent any time with any sort of self-reflection. And oftentimes we become quite weak judges of our own character. And that's why he writes, "As judges of ourselves, we are quick to find escape clauses and take bribes from our emotion." But we can overcome this and become true objective judges of ourselves by taking time to not let our emotions take control of us, and through learning to calm our mind, to make our mind still as water so that it can reflect the world around it. Gracian goes on to write, "The ancients wrote it forever in letters of gold on the wall of Delphus, and in character of esteem in the souls of the wise. Know thyself. Of all living creatures, only man mistakes his end. Only he can stumble, led astray by the very nobility of his free will. And the person who begins by not knowing himself will never know anything else. What good is wisdom unless you are wise to yourself? We degenerate into the slaves of our slaves as often as we submit to vice. No robber, no sphinx, assails the traveler, assaults the living, like self-ignorance. Ignorance condemned to stupidity when it does not know, and it does not notice its lack of attention. He's saying we can be led astray by the very gift that can free us, which is our own free will. It is our own free will that can prevent us from knowing ourselves by distracting ourselves and using our free will to entertain things that actually does not make us wise, does not lead us into understanding what our true end or telos or goal is in life. And the question that only the wise can answer is, what is the end of man? What is the purpose of this life? As Tolstoy ends up saying in his confession, any answer to the meaning of life, to the purpose of life, if you don't live a life that is worthy of answering that question, you will never get the right answer. And that is what he found, because he says, I asked this question to myself, and the only thing I came up with was that life was meaningless, that all was meaningless, that everything I did had no meaning, and so I wanted to end my life. But then he ends up realizing that the only reason he answered the question, the perennial question, the question that people have asked over the centuries, and answered it the way he did, is because he lived a life that he says was a life of debauchery, of a life filled with vices, a life filled with vanity. And because he was coming from that experience, from his subjective experience, he tried to answer an objective question through that experience and ended up coming with the best answer, which was, this is all meaningless. But obviously, as we know, Tolstoy ends up finding an answer that satisfies him. With Baltasar Gracian, he writes, let the discreet begin to know by knowing themselves. Attentive to their own temperament and reason, doing violence to one's temperament has often led to disaster. Meaning, if you don't take hold of your temperament, right? If you don't understand yourself, your temperament will take hold of you and it will lead to disaster. There's a quote from G.K. Chesterton when he's talking about a madman, and he says, a madman is someone who has lost everything but his rationality. And the reason for that is when you don't have a moral framework, when you don't have wisdom, you are able to justify whatever it is you want through your rationality. And you and I both know very well that we can justify whatever it is that we want to justify, right? If we want something, we can do retrospective justification on it and say, oh, this, right? These are the premises, and so the conclusion is what we were looking for, and then so you find the conclusion for it, and you justify it all. And so similarly here, if you know yourself, if you know your temperament, if you know your passions, if you know your weaknesses, then you will be able to rein them in and let them serve you versus you serving them. And Gracian says, one of the vulgar disorders of mankind is to make ends into means and means into ends. What was meant to be something passing, people make into something lasting, and they sit down to rest in the middle of the road. His point here is, on this journey of life, we have to be careful not to turn things that are supposed to be means into ends, right? Similar to what Joseph Pieper says about leisure and work, in that we mistake work as the end-all be-all. And through that, we become obsessed with working. We become obsessed with being hyper-productive, such that we forget that life is not work. And a good life is one where we understand rest. For in learning to rest properly, work becomes meaningful. And we don't end up mistaking ends into means and means into ends. And on that note, in a few weeks, I'm doing a silent retreat at a monastery, which I finally was able to book. Every time I've called for the past few years, they've been booked out, and I was able to find a few days that are free. And I'm going out with a friend who's also doing a silent retreat. And doing a silent retreat for me is a practical way to help me understand and know myself better, to see where my failings are, where my weaknesses are, and also where my strengths are, and spend a few days contemplating, reflecting on my life, on the things that I've done, on the things that I would like to do, but more specifically, to contemplate and to rest through meditation, through prayer, through writing. As I've mentioned before, I highly recommend doing a silent retreat, even if it's just a day. And this is my first time going to a monastery, and I've done it outside of the monastery in my own home as well. So you could do it wherever you are. But it would be interesting in the future if we could do a Becoming Antifragile silent retreat, maybe once a year for a few days, bringing together like-minded people of high character to not only connect, but to share a space, a time of contemplation, a time of reflection, where we can silence the noise and know ourselves better. I'll let you know in a few weeks once I come back how it went. Now, returning to this book, Gracian, he's talking about wisdom, he's talking about virtue. He goes on to talk about happiness. It's very interesting, his point about happiness. So at first he says, Seneca said it well, if you can imprison your appetite between a piece of bread and a little water, you can be as happy as Jove. I cast my ballot like this. True happiness consists not in having it all, but in desiring nothing. Right after he says this, Gracian, however, is not happy with it, and he immediately goes on to dispute this by suggesting that this advice of Seneca's would reduce noble human nature to nothingness. Since we want nothing, we'll end up achieving nothing. And I quote, to want nothing and achieve nothing, what is this but to annihilate taste, nullify life, and reduce all to naught? Life is nothing but to enjoy the advantage of both nature and art, and to do so with measure and moderation. The distinction he makes between non-desire and moderation, non-desire is one extreme, and the other extreme that he is implying here is greed, right? Greed being the other extreme. Too much ambition leads to all sorts of greed, and he's very well aware of this. He is also aware because he's surrounded by noblemen, by politicians. But one thing he wants to stay away from is inaction. And inaction for him happens when there is no ambition. So he's saying, look, you want a little bit of want in your life, because through want, then you can have these other things, right? You can achieve these things. You can enjoy nature, you can enjoy art much more. And according to Gracian, we should focus on learning to implement moderation in our lives, similar to what Aristotle talks about in his Ethics. Gracian's not necessarily contradicting himself in this particular instance, because he's talked about the importance of virtue, and moderation is ultimately what virtue is, right? It is the extremes of two, of rashness and cowardliness. The moderation of those two is courage. It's also important to note that for Gracian, he's a man of culture. He's surrounded, as we mentioned earlier, and supported by a nobleman whose library he has access to, and it's filled with art, sculpture, armors, weapons, all these things. So Gracian is, in one sense, retrospectively justifying the life that he's living. That should be noted here. But then Gracian goes on and sort of expounds on happiness. He writes, to know happiness, you must know its opposite. Only a hungry man relishes his food, and a thirsty one his drink, a tired one his rest. Those who most treasure a prolonged peace are those who have gone through the misery of war. You will see many who do not relish their goods because they have never tasted evils. And thus, I would say that the person who is happy is the one who has been unhappy. Here you're seeing the aspect duality of happiness and of suffering, of tiredness and of rest, of peace and of war. Gracian says, to enjoy the opposite, which is good, you have to experience the opposite, which is bad. Darkness implies light, and happiness is only understood through her opposite, which is suffering. This is the nature of life, the yin and yang. But the yin and yang is contained within the same circle. And one of the key aspects to living a happy life, to living a life filled with happiness, according to Gracian, is being filled and surrounded by people who hold to similar values as you, who have high character, who are interested in the intellectual life, who can appreciate art, who aren't controlled by their passions. So he writes, it is a great stroke of luck to meet people of the same character and intellect, an art to know how to seek them, and a still greater art to keep them. There is no one who does not enjoy a moment of conversation, especially when one's character is singular. One of the 4 ways of knowing for Gracian is to have conversations with wise people. And for him, happiness, the equation for happiness requires this one aspect, to have these conversations with wise people who are of same character, good intellect. And he goes on to say, it is beautiful to have chosen our friends freely, because oftentimes luck chooses it for us, or fate chooses it for us. It ends up choosing where we live, who our parents will be, what we will do. It ends up assigning our friends, servants, and spouse. And in our lives, some of us, however, are lucky in the kind of parents we have, the siblings that we have, the community that we're brought into, the friends that we have. Others are not so lucky. So for Gracian, it is crucial you take it upon yourself to find good people, like-minded people, people who are committed to being wise, committed to becoming virtuous, and are on their path. For you to become friends with them, and for them to become friends with you. And there are different levels of friendship, but the most important is a friend who helps you achieve your perfection, who walks beside you, converses with you, is a voice of reason in tumultuous times, a place of rest during your suffering. This is a friend whose character you admire, right? Ultimately, the best of friends are friendships based in virtue. They are friends who help each other strive towards truth, towards goodness, towards beauty. These friendships ultimately end up being long-lasting because they are rooted in character and not shallow. They're not rooted in the usefulness of the friends, right? Friendships that are useful or situational, where you're friends with them just because you're in the same vicinity as each other, or because they want something from you or you want something from them, those never end up lasting. There are very few things in our life that we can really choose, right? We can't choose our parents, we can't choose our siblings, and oftentimes, as Gracian says, you don't end up choosing your friends. You also oftentimes don't end up choosing what it is that you're going to do with your life, right? You're thrust upon these inclinations and desires through your parents, through your upbringing. But the thing Gracian is emphasizing is you have to make sure you choose your friends well. Because if you choose your friends well, and if you have wise friends, then you too, in return, will not only live a happy life, but you will live a good life. You'll live a life that's worthy of living, because at the end of it, you will have cultivated your virtues. And the other important thing is, crucially important if you end up getting married, is finding a good spouse. A good spouse is ultimately your best friend. A friendship, in one sense, based in virtue. You are both helping each other become better and helping each other strive towards beautiful things, strive towards goodness, strive towards truth. And so choosing a spouse is extremely important, and choosing friends are extremely important. I'll do an episode on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics sometime in the future, where he talks about friendship, talks about a bunch of other things. But I think it's, again, for Gracian, it is an art to know how to seek good people, and it is still a greater art to know how to keep them as friends. All of these different aspects are getting to how you can be a hero in your own life. And if you cultivate wisdom, virtue, reflect on your death, these are aspects in your life that will help you live a heroic life. So he writes, usually what is most comfortable and enjoyable is least heroic. A person who is truly excellent should not limit himself to one perfection or another, but rather with infinite ambitions aspire to a laudable universality. His knowledge should be more intense the more important his occupation. Don't trap yourself in one-dimensionality. You, after all, are a human being, a rational creature, born to learn, filled with wonder. Gracian wants you to use your mind to explore the depths of wisdom, to become great artisans, to become great statesmen, to become great philosophers. The one thing that heroes don't do is they don't settle for mediocrity in any area of life and in any area that you pursue. You're always striving for excellence. Similar to what Confucius says in the Analects, in all that you do, do it to your utmost excellence. And if you do that, then you will have lived a good life. And so he gives this example of Diego Velázquez, who's a very famous painter. So he writes, a certain gallant painter, he's referring to Velázquez here, saw that Raphael, Titian, and others were impossible to overtake. So Raphael, Titian, if you don't know, are very famous artists who did realistic art. Their painting strokes were very fine. It was sometimes hard to tell. So I'm continuing. Their fame grew even livelier after their death. He called on all his powers of invention, he here referring to Diego Velázquez, rather than paint with refinement, for here he could only emulate them. He cultivated a certain bold, rough manner, gallantly telling his critics that he would rather be first in coarseness than second in delicacy. The only way Diego Velázquez became Diego Velázquez is by understanding himself and through that understanding others. And in that moment, he created his own style. He created his own way of painting, which made him a very well-known artist. Challenge for this week is to evaluate whether you are a good friend to other people, whether you help others strive towards their own perfection, towards their own excellence. And secondly, whether you have good friends, whether your friends are ones who build you up, who help you strive towards the good, the beautiful, the excellent, or friends who tear you down and who rather live in this world that Gracian does not like, which is this world of vice, filled with vanity, filled with gossip, filled with anger. And with that, I'm going to wrap. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts on your phone or on Spotify on your phone, click the 3 buttons on the side on Spotify to rate the show. And for Apple, scroll down to the bottom of the podcast. You'll see 5 stars down there. Give it a rating, drop a comment. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at ij@becomingantifragile.com. I'll be happy to reply to questions you have about the books, about the episodes. Till next week, peace.